Hey there. I tend to spend a lot of time talking with entrepreneurs and business owners that are pretty interested in psychology, which, of course, maybe that's why they would employ a clinical psychologist as their executive coach. One of the things that comes up sometimes in conversation that I think makes everybody chuckle a little bit is I believe that Sigmund Freud was right about a lot of things. And I think that surprises the entrepreneurs that I work with who, might see some of Freud's ideas as archaic or out of touch, or, they're definitely anti-feminist. That's true. And I'm not a psychoanalyst. I don't practice like traditional Freudian therapy or coaching. But I do think that Freud offered the world some really interesting ideas, and that those ideas have some implications for how entrepreneurs can be successful and thriving in their lives. So 3 things that I think Freud was more right about than he was wrong about. The first is the absolute importance of the early childhood experience. Freud was really the first thinker, philosopher, to think that what mattered to children was important. Before that, I think children were really seen as sort of this immature entity that wasn't really taking in information or interacting with the world in a meaningful way. But Freud focused really the whole of personality development on the first, 5 to 6 years of life. And he believed that the way that children navigated different developmental milestones was incredibly important to who they would become and have really permanent implications for the kind of psychological structures that they would carry forward throughout their lives. I think it's really difficult to actually argue that Freud was wrong about that. Maybe he was not totally keyed in some of his ways of thinking about what children were doing. I mean, if you remember your Freudian theory, he really focused on psychosexual development. So he sort of sexualized all of these developmental challenges that young children were experiencing. And maybe that emphasis on sexuality is not quite right, but the overwhelming sort of body of research that has happened in the years since Freud, certainly in more recent years with the adverse childhood experiences study, and even a better understanding of developmental neurology, has really pointed to the fact that the things that happen in the first 5 years of life leave a very significant imprint on psychological development throughout the duration of someone's entire life. So early life mattered a great deal, and Freud was the first person to really say that in a systematic way. And I think his ideas have been really instrumental and have been somewhat vindicated in more recent years with, like I mentioned, our new capacity for neuroimaging studies and for understanding how development happens over the course of someone's life. Hard to argue that the first 5 years aren't of extraordinary importance. The second thing that Freud really, I think, was right about was this idea that we are people in tension, that our psyches are somewhat complicated. So Freud, again, you probably remember from your college Psych 101 class, Freud believed that there were parts of the psychological structure that were really in conflict with each other. And he talked about those as the id, the ego, and the superego. The id, of course, being the desire-driven, I want what I want, I get what I get, more maybe animalistic version of us. The ego being the part of us that is more organized, success, achievement-oriented, and is trying to really survive and thrive in the world. And the superego being the societal ideas about morality and behavior that we take in through religious structures, through families, etc. So these 3 aspects of our personality are kind of fighting with each other. The id wants to go out and have a really good time. And the ego's like, hey, if you go out and have a really good time, if you, drink all that alcohol and sleep with all those people, you're probably going to have some consequences. And then the superego is over there saying, no, id, you can't do that. You can't do that. It's evil. It's immoral. You will be ostracized from society. You will lose your relationships. And so the extent to which these 3 elements dance with each other becomes a little bit of how we navigate the world. I do think that we are a bit more complicated than the id, ego, superego, but if you listened to my podcast or watched my video on internal family systems, you'll see that that's a very modern idea of how an internal psyche works. And it still uses that sort of elements or pieces or parts in conflict, which was originally Freud's idea. I just think it's also really helpful for us to recognize how we have drives there are different parts of us with different drives, different motivations. A part of us to be socially accepted, a part of us to be successful or financially successful, a part of us that wants love and fun and play and sex and like the party. And those parts exist to some extent within each of us. And we turn the dials up and down on each of those instincts or impulses. And that shapes how we show up. It shapes what we prioritize. It shapes how we navigate the world around us. So Freud was right about that. Number 3, third point that Freud pretty much nailed is this idea of the unconscious. This idea that there are parts of us that have motivations, drive, energy that we don't have full awareness of. And I have seen this play out over and over again in my own life, in the lives of the many, many entrepreneurs and leaders that I've served over the years. That sometimes the things that we do or the things that we're drawn to or the decisions that we make are not operating up here in our prefrontal cortex, that we are pulled into a story or a cycle or a set of motivations that we don't always have perfect vision about. We can't always fully articulate why I did the thing or why I want something, why I chose that person as my, chief of staff or as my right-hand person. I think we like to think about ourselves, especially we entrepreneurs like to think about ourselves as these very logic-driven entities where we have good knowledge, good working knowledge of what we want and how we're trying to get it. But there's always this sort of X factor. There's always this part of us that we can't quite get to that is our unconscious, and it is powerful and it can make decisions and it can derail us. And it's important to know it's there, even if you can't fully access it. So Freud really led the conversation about understanding what is happening inside of us that we don't always have working knowledge of. So his interest in dreams was in a way to get at or try to understand unconscious material. His interest in things like free association, he had all these tools that people use to try to get at unconscious content. He thought that the process of therapy was a way to get at unconscious content. And I can attest that in my many years of working closely with people over time, there are tells about what the unconscious is doing and working on that do come up in that talk process that people don't always have awareness of until it's reflected back to them. And that's some of what a therapist or a coach is doing, is reflecting some of the unconscious back and making it conscious, trying to help bring it to the surface so that the person who's doing the work has more access to it. So those are the 3 main things that I wanted to highlight. Freud's emphasis on internal conflict, Freud's emphasis on the unconscious, and Freud's emphasis on the developmental importance of the first 5 years of life. There are actually a lot of other things that I think really still shape the way that modern psychology functions that have their origins in Freud. Things like defense mechanisms, things like psychosexual development. I think that's the part of Freud's work that people get a little about. But I believe that our sexuality has really significant consequences for how we show up at work, how we show up in our walking around life, the extent to which we are exploring our bodies and our impulses as kids is an important part of our development. And Freud talked a lot about that, maybe overemphasized it, but I think highlighting its importance for a community of people who at the time were incredibly repressed around bodies, around impulses, around drives, around sexuality, was an important, thing that he brought forward in the world. He did a lot of cocaine and really thought that would be super helpful for people's mental health. So he was right-ish, although, I think cocaine is probably not a long-term sustainable mental health intervention. So didn't quite get that one right. But I don't know, I think for some of us, maybe he's worth another look. But there are old ideas that can be applied in new ways to be helpful and interesting for those of us who are trying to do amazing things in our lives and be as healthy and as self-aware as we can possibly be. Freud might have some helpful tactics and tricks. Thanks so much for listening.